All right. I know this chapter has a lot. I think it's really good information and useful information. And so hang with me. We're not going to spend near as much time on this. Not that it's not equally important, it is less prevalent. Most likely, you're going to have a specialist involved if their visual impairment is, pretty significant. I think pick up what you can as we kind of go over this in little depth. And also, though, just consider that it's more than just considering kids who are completely blind. There are students with visual impairments, maybe more prevalent than you realize. And so think about that as we're going through this too, not just those that are blind. Oops, sorry, I think I skipped one. Yeah. So if we're going to define visual impairment, there are actually 65 different definitions in different research articles and professional literature, which I find interesting. But IDEA, that federal mandate, defines it as a visual impairment that includes blindness, means an impairment in vision that, even with correction, adversely affects a child's educational performance. So basically, if a child wears glasses and um, it's corrected, even though they have, a visual impairment, if it's corrected, it's not most likely going to be, impacting their educational performance. However, those students who, even with correction, their vision is still unique or different, then that's when we would consider them to be visually impaired um, and get that eligibility because it's affecting their education. And so, for an educational purpose, a child who learns primarily through tactile or auditory input is what they would consider blind. And that's what I'm saying. If you're going to have somebody working with the visual instructionist in your district, they might consult, but it typically requires some pretty significant issues to where um, they are highly involved in serving the student directly. Um, and legally, though, a visual impairment, I just thought this was interesting, is that if you do not have 20/20 vision in at least one eye, and that can be with correction with your contacts or glasses on, um, then you are legally blind. What does early development look like in this population? It's very much like sighted children, but what really versus the quantity, it's usually the qualitative difference. So their motor development is delayed, which can just decrease their experiences, and their cognitive development. They have a different difficulties around perspective taking. And children who are blind may not naturally reinforce interaction as typically developing children. That same thing that's just we talk about over and over and over again in these areas of disability is if they don't have as much opportunity to practice their social language, that impacts them socially and it impacts their language, their vocabulary, and their grammar and everything. So these 4 areas, let's look at these real quick. There's not a lot of research in each area, which is part of why we can review it rather quickly. In just talking about how visual impairment affects your ability to learn phoneme, there's limited research, but so far there's not a significant difference. How it affects their grammar, their MLU, their mean length of utterance, which you've done by now with your language sample, is the same. It might be slightly shorter, but not alarmingly shorter. They might use fewer spatial prepositions because it's not that they don't understand them, but they don't see them all the time. They're not as prevalent in their mind. And then they might just use fewer types of sentences. Sorry. And semantics or vocabulary, they tend to be more talking about the present. They don't always use as much imaginative talk. They can confuse their pronouns, I and you. So these are pretty minimal differences. But again, this is where we talk about perspective taking, which is what the acquisition of theory of mind is the ability to kind of take in your environment and perceive things and kind of adjust your actions based on what others are expecting of you behaviorally. For instance, you could walk into a quiet room and assume that everybody's really sad about something. You don't see anything. So you walk into a quiet room and you go up to someone and say, "I'm really sorry. What happened?" And then they say to you, "Shh, no, we're quiet because we're having a surprise party." It's like, oh, how would they ever know that just from the lack of that visual perspective taking? And perspective taking is more than just visual, but it's a big part of it. And so, how they acquire it and the amount of experiences they have, they're just going to need more to understand that because they are lacking one input of visually understanding that, which also affects pragmatics. But if they use a loud voice, if they have a harder time understanding the needs of their listener, again, this is an area where we're definitely listening to what they're saying, but we're reading their face. We can tell if someone disagrees or isn't understanding what we're saying, and we adapt. But if they can't read that, they might just keep talking, and you're going to be thinking, "Oh, why do they keep talking?" But they don't have those cues. They might use slightly different gestures or body postures or facial expressions because they are not seeing any to imitate. I mean, depending if they're truly blind at birth. And then it's trivial, but those little things can lead to a total misunderstanding of communicative intent because we say that a lot of language is nonverbal. I think about this. This is a big issue in the field of autism right now, and I'm sure other disabilities. But if you're pulled over by a police officer and they don't know immediately that you have some kind of disability, they could quickly interpret your actions as insubordinates when maybe it's a misunderstanding. And so just think about that. And then multiply it towards all of their experiences. What people assume without knowing is the cause for the way they're acting or communicating. So we definitely want to consider all those things. And then, of course, literacy. What does this look like? Limited research indicates that although children who are blind may experience some delays, they can attain high levels of literacy if they have that appropriate instruction and accommodation. If they have mild to moderate VI, they just tend to fall behind. They might have a difficulty fixating on the text or getting information from their peripheral vision field. And they might have limited direct experience to connect concepts to. So they're listening to a story about a fire truck, but unless that story also goes into what that fire truck looks like, you know how we kind of paint these pictures in our mind, someone has to paint them verbally for them as well. The variation is very great in this population, how it's going to the implications for your teaching, because it totally depends upon they're totally blind or not, really, just their level of impairment. But you always need to ask, are there current delays in their development? Is there essential vocabulary missing? Do they show any difficulty expressing themselves or understanding what other people are saying to them? And then, of course, asking, do I suspect anything else is going on here, or is this just a result of that visual impairment? We need to look at any other information we have. We need to look at the parents' education about their visual impairment. Are they aware? What have they done so far? We need to try and disrupt and alter any behavior that is interfering with their intervention progress. Then language-wise, we're going to target vocabulary. We're going to help them, give them the verbal vocabulary they need to understand nonverbal communication that they can't see, and help them just kind of explicitly teach language for different communication situations. And then pronoun practice. It doesn't hurt. I think it's the least of the worries for them. And so lastly, here's another case study that I want you to read through and think, get some ideas, and then think what other instructional methods could have been used. The last note on this, we didn't go specifically into Braille and literacy instruction involving Braille because that really is uh, that is a very specific intervention that is completely appropriate, but it's it's what do I want to say? It's rare. Its incidence is much lower, and um, we didn't. This chapter, this book, just didn't really focus on that. So yes, it's definitely a recognized and used instructional method, but I am in no way qualified to teach you anything about how to use it. Um, but obviously, some people with visual impairment choose uh, to use Braille if they're profoundly blind. All right. Of course, email me with questions or concerns about what you heard, especially those of you that are have specific knowledge in one of these areas. I'm always willing to learn and grow. So make sure you complete this quiz and go on to the next chapter. And you're welcome to take the next chapter quiz before the lecture or wait till that one's posted. And then make sure you're working on your final assignment. I don't want that to sneak up on you. See you next time.